All right, we're going to talk about a James Lindsay video, who I criticize endlessly. Professional mangler philosophy and his strange opinion that people like Tucker Carlson and so-called groypers or literal Nazis or Holocaust deniers like Nick Fuentes are woke for some reason. So let's play the video here. Oops, I shouldn't full screen myself. Here we go.
That's the very near end of this pool, but this pool gets dark pretty quick. At the far end of the pool, we have agitators like the so-called Groyper group. It's America First is how they brand themselves, led by a character named Nick Fuentes, who is a very curious individual for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, for those who don't know, in the thumbnail, he's in the center and he's literally a Nazi and a Holocaust denier. And he was at that infamous meeting with Trump and him and Kanye years ago. But he now feels betrayed by Trump because he thinks he's not far right enough.
I don't need to get into, but there we see not just extraordinary skepticism of Israel, but outright hatred and blame and scapegoating of Jews that reproduce precisely the errors committed in analysis, the hasty generalization or false generalizations done by Adolf Hitler when he was writing Mein Kampf, where they have just noticed. They're always just noticing things and just asking questions. They have just happened to notice.
They're jacking, just asking questions.
That, for example, lots of the progressives in the world are Jewish, or lots of Jews are progressives is maybe a better way to phrase that, and that the Frankfurt School of neo-Marxists was predominantly of ethnically Jewish people who were certainly.
As I always correct him, the people at the Frankfurt School were not fucking neo-Marxists, but that's not really relevant for this video.
Communists as their religion,
no,
and so on and so forth, to conclude that the Jews are.
Even if you think that they were Marxists, which they weren't, they were sure as fuck not communists. The people at the Frankfurt School, like I've talked about many times before, they weren't like classical Marxists. They were different kind of Marxists who looked at the cultural aspects of capitalism that still lay remnant in society after the end of communism.
Jews are actually running an operation of stolen power to run the world to their own advantage, to the destruction of everybody else, including, referring to them as satanic and all of this.
This is the neo-Nazi conspiracy theories that he's talking about, and good for him for actually fucking criticizing them, because his talking points, as I've discussed before, get to almost Holocaust denying levels.
Nick Fuentes claims to be ultra Catholic. He more or less demands his followers follow or go to the Latin Mass, kind of very extreme traditionalist in that regard. They are extraordinarily anti-gay. Everybody who they disagree with gets some kind of a slur attached to them for this. I have had all of them. It doesn't matter whether it's in the gay department or whether it's in the Jewish department or in the neocon department. They hate all of those things. But of course, distrust of neoconservatism.
They've called him that. I don't think he's even fucking Jewish. That makes no sense.
Is kind of the defining characteristic of paleoconservatism that's in the Tucker Carlson line. So Tucker Carlson does not have the same degree of hatred, as I see no visible or obvious hatred of Jews like you see with the Groypers. But you do see, and I see some isolationism and nativism on his end. What you see in extremists with Nick Fuentes' so-called America First movement, where in fact he has a extraordinarily narrow understanding of what qualifies as American and what needs to be put first.
Yeah, James Lindsay himself obviously has a very fucking narrow understanding of that and mangles philosophy all the time to form his elaborate wacko conspiracy theories, but nowhere near as bad as Nick Fuentes in that sense. In turn, his sense of what it means to be American is obviously way more fucking narrow than that of James Lindsay, right?
and what's to be done with everybody who doesn't qualify according to that definition. It's a very extreme version. There are also on the extreme end who are not necessarily Nick Fuentes or his groypers, as they are called. There's also a phenomenon of proto-fascists openly supporting fascist dictators like Pinochet and Francisco Franco from Spain as having saved Spain from communism. The Spanish Civil War is a topic of great interest. These people like to read philosophers like Julius Evola, who was a fascist. They will also occasionally, read or report from Mussolini. They like to do edgy memes around Hitler. They like to do edgy memes around Mussolini. They are, like I said, proto-fascists. They frequently believe that we need something like an American Franco. You will hear them making jokes referencing Pinochet by talking
American Franco, aka Trump,
about the need
who
to
now is the American Franco or Mussolini or whoever the fuck you want to compare him to.
give helicopter rides to communists, what that refers to as Pinochet's practice of getting communists out of his country by rounding them up, arresting them, putting them in helicopters, flying them out to sea, and throwing them out so that they would die in the ocean.
See, even though obviously I criticize James Lindsay all the time, at least he seems like sympathetic about the communists being dumped into the fucking ocean, even though he calls everything fucking communism.
If you didn't know what helicopter rides are about, that's what it was about. So there is a proto-fascist wing. Some people are explicitly pro-fascist, except one of the hardest things to tell, and one of the reasons why woke right might be the right term for these people, about this group is it's almost impossible to ever tell when they're serious. Tucker Carlson is more obviously serious most of the time, but when we get into this further reach, this deeper end of the pool, we see, and Nick Fuentes seems extraordinarily serious all the time, but with these proto-fascists, we see an awful lot of postmodern, detached indifference. They are just.
That's why I think the people he's describing are more like postmodern conservatives than actually like. There's nothing fucking woke about Tucker Carlson or Nick Fuentes. Like they're the most anti-woke type of people that they can possibly be, right? They do have sort of a postmodern or post-structuralist conservative view on society, I think, which is kind of what he describes here when he says that word.
Memeing, they're just trolling, they're just putting out Hitler stuff to get a rise. They don't really mean it.
Just asking
but they also would definitely understand from an operational perspective that what they're doing is moving the Overton window. What they're doing is recruiting members to them under this idea of, well, if we're going to have free speech, let's test the absolute boundaries of it, but not so much in a random way, but in a very specific way that pushes certain ideas that people might not have thought of. And somewhere in the middle of this woke right, you'll find characters who are taken up with philosophers such as Carl Schmitt, who a lot of people aren't familiar with. They get very upset when it's pointed out that he was given the title under Hitler's regime of the crown jurist of the Third Reich. He was a
literal actual Nazi.
He was trying to stop Hitler from his rise before Hitler took the chancellery, I should say, in 1933, and that's true. And he seemed to be anti-communist and anti-fascist at the same time up to that point. But Hitler got power in 1933, and within weeks, Carl Schmitt was a Nazi, and he never recanted of any of that. And they like to point to the complicated historical contingencies that led him to take this choice by expedience, but that's no small choice. But Carl Schmitt's main philosophical ideas that they're in favor of, that he's put forth, are two. One is called the unbound executive. The executives should be unbound,
People
or else
talked about that theory with Trump, why they want him to get elected, right? We'll see whether that happens. I think it might.
They are not sovereign. Sovereign means that you are not bound, say, by rule of law. So they want an executive who isn't bound by a limitation on power, who can do what needs to be done in order to fight back their enemies, who in this case are primarily, as they say, communists, but they also explicitly blame classical liberals, as did Carl Schmitt, for many of the ills.
Yeah, they think they're literally communists
of society. It's a very common belief in this circle, not that it necessarily agrees with Carl Schmitt that, in fact, communism or Marxism is an outgrowth of classical liberalism, which I don't think washes any more than the confusion about the different Scottish common sense real.
You could argue that's a plausible argument, I think. Oh, there's my dog. Want to see my cute dog? Oh, he has thoughts. I hate James Lindsay. Okay. Back to the video.
Sense realism versus the continental enlightenments. I think it's equally confused. The second of Carl Schmitt's big ideas that he puts forth is called the friend-enemy distinction, and that's its own whole topic, a long podcast to get into, and I don't want to drag this out. But the friend-enemy distinction effectively says that in politics, at the end of the day, it all boils down, just like how in morality it all boils down to good versus evil, and in epistemology it all boils down to true versus false, and in ethics it all boils down to right versus wrong, and in aesthetics it all boils down to beautiful versus ugly. In politics it all boils down to friend versus enemy. So it's all about
sounds kind of like James Lindsay's perspective against leftists, but at least he's criticizing actual Nazis.
mutually, well, I don't know how to say this grammatically. It is all about polarized groups with mutual enmity that defines the political process, where the enmity is given as the division between friends and enemies, and an enemy is defined as a person or group that wishes to end your way of life, and friends are people who are willing to die in order to defend that with you. And Carl Schmitt's belief, and I disagree with it, I think in a sophisticated way. I've taken the time to study it. Carl Schmitt's view is that at the end of the day, all politics boils down to the friend-enemy distinction, and that his critique of classical liberalism, which is not based on the misunderstanding of the Enlightenment tradition, his critique of liberalism as a political philosophy is that liberalism removes the political from politics by taking violence off of the table, because the friend-enemy line is always underwritten by violence. So when you remove violence from the equation entirely, all you're left with is talking and talking and talking, and that prevents you from being able to stop an enemy who's sufficiently intolerant. But he says that
what a shocker. The Nazi is a fan of violence.
This is rather than saying that this is a hard question of the paradox of tolerance, which is what I believe it actually is, he answers that this is a intrinsic internal contradiction of liberalism that makes it unworkable. It's very common to find somewhere in this woke right spectrum, also usually adjacent to the people who are big fans of Carl Schmitt, but not always overlapping, is so-called Straussians, who are followers of...
Remember, I've been making some videos on Leo Strauss's book on Spinoza's critique of religion.
Philosophy of Leo Strauss. I'm not going to get into Straussianism, not because... not for any better reason that I don't actually know it very deeply yet. I know some broad themes, but Strauss seems, in my opinion, to reinvigorate a dialectical approach to the movement of history, talking about it moving in waves or phases that incorporate past phases and transform them to a new form. And I'm immediately skeptical of that. But the Straussians have profoundly deep criticisms of classical liberalism that I think are misguided, and I've heard some of those criticisms, but that's not what it's for. But I've given this broad mixture of views that fit in the woke right, and this is parallel to how the woke left both was, especially before, we'll use 2014 and 15 as the marker, especially before then, but also still afterwards. You have kind of milquetoast progressives who think they're just doing the right thing. You have old hippies from the old civil rights era. You also have hardened communists and very radical actors. You also have some just kind of left-wing anarchists. You have this very kind of broad, messed up coalition. You also have basically kind of a deracinated or a subverted liberal as a generic member of this woke left who's taken on woke ideals, even though if you were to pin them down, they don't actually agree with them. It's a very broad concept, but we still have this notion of a label called woke that fits them. And the reason that we adopt woke, from my perspective, isn't just because they used it as a slang term for themselves, and then we took it up, which is true. but is also because it's very descriptive of what's going on. And what's going on in the woke left is that they believe that they have woken up to a belief or a structure, a hidden structure to how society is organized and operates. In other words, I'm analyzing and using
That's
the
what
word
conservatives believe when they're red-pilled.
woke at the level of operating system, how it runs. And what they believe is they've woken up to the true nature of reality, which is that powerful groups.
Saying that far right wingers have the same type of operating system as far left people, which I think is actually true, because they're far right and far left, and they have the friend versus enemy distinction, which he has against lefties too, but obviously not to the same degree.
Powerful interest groups have lied to the world about how the world works, and everybody is misled and operating under a false consciousness, but they have woke up to this and have done the analysis and presented an alternative view of how the
Woken.
world really proceeded in history and works in theory and in practice, and they act upon that awakened status that other people outside don't have, and they claim the basis of their epistemic authority from knowing the true hidden history. And this is the key point that makes it woke. You woke up to that which they have hidden from you. And for them, with CRT, the white people hid the true history of race and racism and its true practice and purpose. For Marxists,
No, as we've been through many times.
the bourgeois class has hidden the true nature of economics and social organization to their own benefit from the proletariat. And we could go down the list. I think that 2 examples are sufficient. Maybe we could do queer theory. The normal have hidden the true nature of normalcy and legitimacy from the abnormal or deviant or queer, to their exclusion from the fruits of society, and so on and so forth. And thus they become the awakened revolutionary vanguard, and they know how society actually works, and they claim an epistemic authority over others who are not trapped in that so-called false consciousness that they, the powers, the ruling classes, have installed in them. And my contention is that the entire spectrum of people that I
He's so goddamn pedantic. Wow.
described on the woke right are not merely providing different conservative theories about how the world works, whether those are, relatively mainstream conservative paleo conservatism like Tucker Carlson, whether those are a little less mainstream like the Straussians, or like Burke, or if they're rather extreme, like taking up with Julius Evola or proto-fascists or Franco or whatever else you want, or whatever the hell Nick Fuentes is doing. And there's a variety of other views in between. What they all share in common is that they, whether it's the intelligence apparatus, whether it's the Jews, whoever it is, have actually hidden reality from us, and
Yep.
they have awakened or woke up to
Conspiracy
that true
theories.
reality and a true alternative theory of how the world works and operates. And they claim epistemic authority that they can use to advance their cause and silence others, in order to push it forward. Terms that attach to these people can be anything from America First, which is complicated because it means other things, but also post-liberal. A post-liberal right would be okay, except it's kind of too many syllables. Nobody really knows what liberal means. Post is confusing, and there's a hyphen. That's usually not a good sign for that post-liberal right feels like regressive left to me, and it's descriptive sort of and is not going to stick. But they are in general skeptical of, if not outright hostile to, liberalism writ large, but also including American liberalism, and also frequently, therefore, including the Constitution. And I'm not saying, just to be very clear, that Tucker Carlson hates the
Yeah,
Constitution.
fascists like Alexander Dugin, who I've been talking about lately, don't like liberalism.
With this, I'm just saying that he's somewhere in the, we'll call it a rainbow, the spectrum of woke right views, many of which, perhaps not his, and likely perhaps not his, do not include disdain or giving up on the Constitution as it is. But because they feel as though there is an oppressive power out there
Except Tucker Carlson supports Trump, who wants to suspend all articles of the Constitution.
that has hidden the real truth from us, the epistemic authority of all woke comes from the belief that that which has been hidden from us is most true. That which they don't want us to think or
That's what
believe
he believes about COVID and shit.
believe is most true. That which is most sincerely held, just like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in faith is likely to be more true than that which is less sincerely held, because they think that this is all done cynically by the powers. So sincerity becomes a measurement of truth. But more importantly, that which has been hidden from them, that which they don't want us to know. The problem with that, just to make it very clear, is nobody wants to know wrong information, and nobody in a position of educational power wants anybody to know wrong information if it can be avoided. Of course, we all have wrong information, but the idea is to minimize how wrong we are, not maximize it. We all are. They're right, by the way, in that they don't trust our lying, manipulative, mostly Marxist expert class or self-serving expert class.
See?
Right in that. But the thing is there are ideas out there that they don't want us to know, or that they disagree with, or label misinformation because they are wrong. And then there are ones that they actually are trying to suppress because they are right. And it's, you can't use they criticize you for believing this as a litmus test, because it applies to both of those things. You could believe something genuinely crazy, or that is genuinely a foreign influence operation, and the powers that be will say you shouldn't believe that. And you could also believe something that is absolutely true about, say, mRNA vaccines or gene therapies, that they will also say you shouldn't believe that. And so you don't have a sufficient litmus test. In other words, they have a very impoverished epistemology, and their epistemology leads, which is the theory of knowledge, and that leads their bid or claim for authority. And they then proceed in the usual way that the woke proceed. I didn't even get into all the parallels, by the way: victim culture, manipulation of language, outright lying, lies that would be fact-checked as misleading, radical splintering, wedge operations. You go down the list, but the orientation toward victimhood by this power that's suppressing a truth that they've woken up to, and the measurement of that truth is that's what they don't want you to believe, is the hallmark characteristic, and why I've called them the woke right. This podcast has already gone too long, so I'm going to wrap it up and say,
Okay, yeah, I'll stop there. But yeah, I think James Lindsay actually makes some good points. I think he kind of mislabels it, philosophically speaking. I'd call them kind of postmodern conservatives in a way, or Nick Fuentes is just a fascist, but and literally a Holocaust denier and a Nazi. But they do have the same type of operating system in their minds as woke lefties, right? So yeah, that's a really good point. And I criticize James Lindsay all the fucking time, but at least he's criticizing Nazis. So good for him.